Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the George S. and Dolores Doré Eccles Foundation and the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, the eyes of the country remain fixed on the Senate and the potential confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. What is the status of the FBI investigation? What kind of impact will it have? And how have our elected officials weighed in? Stakeholders try to reach a compromise on medical marijuana. What came out of the meetings this week? How would a compromise impact the ballot initiative? And voters throughout the state will soon receive their mail-in ballots. Will this increase turnout? And how could it change Utah's elections? Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Nichole Nixon, reporter with KUER, Robert Gehrke, political columnist with the Salt Lake Tribune, and Glen Beebe, news reporter with ABC4 Utah. We're so glad to have you all with us today. We're going to jump right in because the news today is just hot and happening almost right before our eyes, okay? So let's talk about the confirmation proceedings of Judge Kavanaugh. Big vote happened today. Robert, let's start with you for a minute. The vote was 51-49. It's a cloture vote, which is what they did today, which means they're ending debate to set the stage for a final vote on the nominee, likely this weekend. Any surprises in the vote?
Well, I think the only surprise we had was that we had a Democrat, Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who's in a tight re-election race this year, actually vote for Kavanaugh, and we had a Republican, Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, who voted against it. We sort of expected it to be a party line vote, most likely, but again, Manchin is in a tight race. I think he recognizes that the nomination of Kavanaugh is playing well for the Republican base, and he's got to appeal to some of those conservatives in his state, and so I think he was kind of compelled by politics to do it. Others who are also in tight election races, like Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, ended up still voting against it. She said the other day that she just couldn't, in good conscience, having seen what she's seen, vote for him, even if it costs her seat.
Mm-hmm. Glenn, this is so interesting because what Robert just talked about is just really right on about the politics of this. As people are looking at their own districts, where people are, is that what everyone was thinking when they went to this vote? Was it about the qualifications of this person? Was it really about how is this going to be perceived by my voters back home?
I think it was a little bit of both because, as he said, Heitkamp is in a tight election race and she still voted no. Sometimes you have to vote what you feel, but for people, I mean, it is an election year, and especially for Democrats, there's a lot of red state Democrats running this year, and they have to protect their seats, and so a lot of politics does play into it. I mean, it's always been a political process, but I don't think we've ever seen it this tight or this, I guess, political this late.
And there are other states, Claire McCaskill in Missouri, Bill Nelson in Florida. These are Democrats in tight races who ended up voting against it. What we've seen nationwide is for Republicans who are sort of dispirited coming into the election, this nomination and this nomination fight has really sort of energized that base that was otherwise pretty depressed.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the vote for a second, Nichole, because this cloture vote was important. It was the process to move forward. But is this the end of it? Is this now a foregone conclusion, or do you think there's any chance some people who voted for moving the vote forward will later maybe deem it?
That's always a possibility. The vote today was a vote to end debate on the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. By no means is this a final vote. They're going to make that final vote sometime this weekend, probably Saturday, and senators have been known to change their minds. I think the last big one was last year with health care, and Senator John McCain, I think, had voted to end debate on that, and he changed his mind and gave that famous thumbs down vote on health care.
Well, what's the strategy for a senator to say, yes, let's get it for a real vote? Because they could stop it now, right? If they didn't have the
I think, isn't
cloture.
there a clock? They have to wait a certain amount of time between the ending of the debate and the actual vote. So the pressure's on for these people that are still maybe kind of trying to make up their minds, and the senators like Murkowski and Collins that people aren't totally sure of yet.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's one of those things where, to say I voted against the vote going forward is totally different than I ended up just voting no for this person. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think people can justify necessarily voting no in the cloture, even though that's a strategy sometimes senators use in order to not make a real vote. But I think if people are going to be on the record, then they want to be on the record with how they end up voting, and so that's why they wanted it to move forward.
I want to get to a quote from Senator Orrin Hatch, because all of you talked a little about how people are making up their minds. There was an FBI investigation. They're calling it an investigation, right? It was a report that came out that people have been reviewing for the last couple of days, and all members of the Senate had a chance to review, a couple members of staff. But I want to read this quote from Senator Orrin Hatch at the end of that investigation and then get your thoughts about it. He said, "We have found nothing, absolutely nothing, to corroborate the allegations against him." This is Judge Kavanaugh. "We need to confirm him right away." Robert?
Well, I mean, I think that's predictable. You know, Senator Hatch has been saying since day one on this nomination that they wanted to move it forward quickly. He's been complaining about what he considers delay tactics from the Democrats. And it sort of speaks to the larger issue with this entire thing, is that where people started is largely where they ended up. Nothing they heard during this entire process has changed many minds about Judge Kavanaugh's, you know, whether he belongs on the court or not. It all has sort of been a partisan exercise, and it's been an incredibly divisive partisan exercise. But we've ended up now exactly where we all expected us to end up at the beginning. The New Jersey Congressman Menendez went in and read the same material that Orrin Hatch read, and he came out and said it was a bull something investigation. That, you know, we can't say it on public television or any television.
Thank you for the restraint.
But you know, people still disagree. The partisan divide on this is still there, and that's still what's driving this. The Democrats look at the same information the Republicans do, and they believe Dr. Ford. The Republicans believe Judge Kavanaugh, or think that she's, as Orrin Hatch said, mistaken. That woman's mistaken. He's been saying this from day one, and so of course nobody's mind has been changed. And then the whole thing has caused this giant rift in the Senate. It's caused another rift in the country, and I think it's also caused us to assess how we treat people who come forward with this sort of allegations.
Well, and that's the thing, is how much corroborating evidence are you really going to get? It's probably true that, you know, Senator Hatch didn't see the corroborating evidence that he would have, but even if they had interviewed all of the people that the Democrats claim that they're not interviewing, would you have still had it at the end? And the answer is likely no. I mean, this is a more than 30-year accusation coming forward, but as Paul said, it kind of shows how do we take this going forward when we look at sexual assault or rape allegations, that really there's probably not going to be a lot of evidence either way. The question is, do you believe the person coming forward? And as you know, has been said during this whole confirmation process, this isn't an investigation on whether you did this or didn't. It's an investigation like a job interview. And so, is this someone that you want for this job, knowing what you know?
So, Nichole, is this the right analysis? Because what we're hearing from some people is there's the question of who do you believe versus just pure politics. Are those the same thing, or are they not?
They're different things, but I think that, you know, there's been a lot of comparisons with the Anita Hill hearings in 1991. And I think the main difference this time is that people and senators and Republican senators have said that they believe Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, they believe that she was assaulted. They just don't believe that it was Judge Kavanaugh that did it. And that is a major step forward from what they were saying and what they were saying about Anita Hill and to Anita Hill 27 years ago. Judge Kavanaugh has just, you know, been denying this, and it really has been a he said, she said, and the investigation didn't really change that.
So go ahead, Robert.
Well, I was just going to say, like Glen said, something that happened 35 years ago, you're not going to find physical evidence, you're not going to find records that indicate this. So it was ultimately going to be an inconclusive investigation, I think. But, you know, I think it kind of sends a message. I think something that the president did at a rally last week, where he openly mocked Dr. Ford for not remembering how she got home, or not, you know, and said, oh, she only had one beer, and started questioning. I think that sort of thing is incredibly detrimental. I think it sends a bad message to women who, you know, that there was the "why I didn't report" hashtag that was trending on social media. And all of those people had very valid reasons for not wanting to come forward. Dr. Ford said she didn't want to come forward because she knew she was going to drag her family into the public spotlight. There were death threats. She had to live in hiding. There was questions about her sanity, questions about her past. And all of this stuff is, I think, sends an incredibly damaging message to women and men who are living with this sort of thing on a day-to-day basis.
Well, and you know, you kind of brought it up. I mean, when we talk about 30-year-old allegations. Why is it that when a man comes forward and says, I was molested by a priest 30 years ago, we treat that differently versus a woman who comes forward and says, I was sexually assaulted or raped at a party? And I think really this whole process, aside from the politics, how we treat rape and sexual assault has really just been detrimental. That is hurt. Because in this state, you know, bipartisan support for things like Start By Believing, for testing rape kits, for dealing with this issue in the state. But when you have 1 in 3 women who are sexually assaulted, and even some men who are, seeing this whole process basically says to them, yeah, if you come forward, you're going to still have issues even this many years down the road. And that's where I think really, it's been detrimental to our politics and to the country somewhat. But I think it's been even more detrimental to rape and sexual assault victims. And that's what's really sad.
You know, the president said this week also that it's a scary time for young men in this country. And it is true that Brett Kavanaugh's reputation has been tarnished. I think there will always be this spot on his record, even if he does get on the Supreme Court. But I don't think that you can make the argument that this is a scary time for young men in America unless you happen to be a young man of color. I don't think young men have ever had the fear of walking alone in their own neighborhood or being afraid to leave their drink at a bar to go to the bathroom. I think that's a strange argument to make.
Well, and it's also one of those, I mean, you know, you've also seen some other people say this week things along the lines of, well, you know, if you're tougher on criminals and murders and thieves, that shouldn't worry you unless you're one of those things. And so when someone says it's a sad time for young men in America, no, it's not, as long as you know what consent is and don't sexually assault people.
Well, then we also probably need to address Judge Kavanaugh's performance at the hearing, which was, you know, just one of the retired Supreme Court justices, I think Justice Stevens, said the other day that he demonstrated a demeanor that's not fitting for the Supreme Court. And that's something that I don't think has maybe been getting enough attention. He gave that bombastic response where he was forceful, like yelling and challenging senators, you know, and turned it very political, accusing the Clintons of running this sort of vendetta against him, and he almost came off as unhinged. But again, I think none of it mattered. It was all for show. None of the senators were going to be swayed. I think Senator Flake, by delaying it for a week and saying we want the FBI to investigate people, I think more than anything that was to give them cover so they could say, well, we did it. You know, the FBI did investigate like the Democrats wanted, and we still didn't find anything because, like Glen and I said, that they weren't going to find concrete proof. They weren't going to charge Judge Kavanaugh with a crime because there's just not that level of proof. But it ultimately boils down to who do you believe? And the Republicans were always going to believe Judge Kavanaugh because, frankly, getting Judge Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court was the most important thing for them, more important than trying to get to the bottom of these allegations.
I think the other piece that we have to look at is the fact that this is why we used to have that 60-vote requirement. You used to have bipartisan support, and both Republicans and Democrats are responsible for this now going down to a 50-vote thing. Both of them have done it. It's been a partisan fight since about the year 2000 with these filibusters and everything, but this is why that 60-vote threshold that now no longer exists for almost any position was so important, so that you didn't get partisans, so that you didn't just get someone in by a sliver. That's what we've lost when we lost that 60-vote threshold. And for Republicans who might be celebrating because they're getting a partisan in, just remember the next time the Democrats are in and you get that super liberal person or judge, you're going to be dealing with the same thing and probably using the same lines that the Democrats are using now.
Okay, we're going to go into something almost just as controversial as the confirmation proceedings, and that's marijuana in the state. Thursday of this week, enormous press conferences held in Utah. Stakeholders on both sides of the medical marijuana proposition. Nichole, compromise is what they said they have found. Tell us what that means based on all that's happened.
Well, this comes after so many hours of meetings between lawmakers, patient medical cannabis advocates, people on the other side who have never wanted this compromise or this proposition to pass. They say that they have found some common ground and that they believe there was always a little bit of common ground, and that's what they've worked on. So they announced this compromise bill that whether or not this proposition passes in November, we are going to pass this. The governor said he's willing to call a special session and pass this a week or two after Election Day.
Robert, give us some of the parameters around this compromise.
Well, so I think the biggest thing that's sort of novel about this approach, and we haven't seen it done in any other state, is there's going to be this what's called a central fill pharmacy. So instead of having the prescriptions, if they're you can't call them prescriptions, the recommendations, I guess, filled at various sites around the state, you have one central fill pharmacy that then sends those prescriptions out to either the county health clinics or the or private dispensaries. And so that sort of centralizes the functions of this. So the idea is you have more control over it. They expanded the patient list a little bit, added back in glaucoma, and you know, there is still chronic pain in there, which is sort of a big deal. But so the patient list is basically the same with a few additions. If you get a card, you know, if you qualify for one of these, you get a card from your doctor. You get a checkup, you get a card. You can get your medical marijuana. It's going to take a while to ramp up, but there is a provision in there that within depending on if the initiative passes or if the bill passes, there you get an affirmative defense. So if you have possession of medical marijuana and qualify for one of these conditions, you're not going to be charged with a crime. So you know, it took a lot of doing, as Nichole said. They spent 40 hours over the past week just kind of hashing this out. Not everybody's happy with it. There's, you know, both sides have some questions, some doubts, but you know, it looks like obviously the church, the Utah Medical Association, and law enforcement are much happier with this than they were with the Proposition 2.
And I think that, you know, both sides are going to be happy, as you said, because one of the things is everybody seems to get what they want. The people who are against it seem to get the tight controls that they wanted to make sure stuff doesn't find its way to the black market. Patients get covered. They won't be considered criminals anymore for trying to deal with their pain or their condition. And so that's kind of what people wanted in the end. They just wanted them to have access to it. But it's also one of those things where I think it was a huge risk if we just stuck with the ballot initiative, whether it passed or failed. If it failed, you would have a lot of people who were against it, who, you know, especially with the church coming out against it and others, that would have looked bad. If all of their effort had failed, it might have shown, well, you know, we can't even.
I think what brought the church to this point, though, was their own internal polling, and the internal polling on the other side and public polling all said this was going to pass. And that's really remarkable, because that would mark, first time I can remember, first time in the state history, that the church has been rolled that publicly on a political issue. And they would be getting rolled on this issue, not because non-Mormons didn't like it, it's because their own membership, a large portion of them, came out in support of medical marijuana. And so they had to capitulate. They had to come to the table. Now, they could have fought it. They could have come back in the legislative session and said, we're going to completely undo this, and they have the power to do that. But it would, at the optics of that, first getting beat at the ballot box and then trying to undo that would have just been too much for, I think, the church is very sensitive of its public image, and so I don't think they were willing to go that route.
And I think that was, as you said, that was the risk for Prop 2, those supporters, was that it could just get gutted, that it could get completely changed down the line, and they could have, you know, said, well, it was for safety.
Let's talk about that, Nichole, because there's still a lot to happen, right? So the governor, as you mentioned, said, I will call a special session to sort of put into play all these things we've agreed to. This is after the election. Nichole, if this proposition still goes by, you know, passes by huge margins, I mean, how does that flavor that discussion on this compromise? Or do you think this compromise is going to stand?
I think people are skeptical of the compromise. A lot of people see it as a messaging tactic to try to get people to maybe not turn out to vote for Proposition 2, because they're saying either way, whether the proposition fails or passes, we will have expanded medical marijuana in Utah next year. And some people are maybe, for good reason, cautiously skeptical of that and worried that people are just all these lawmakers and stakeholders and the governor are trying to get people to not turn out to vote for it.
Well, Robert, what about that idea here, right? So both sides said we will stand down on our commercials, all the opposition for and against. What do you think is happening in Utah when people hear that? Everyone hears it as a compromise. I'm voting no now?
Yeah.
Or this trust factor, how does that get in there?
It was interesting because the people who, you know, the UMA, the governor, the people who were opposing Prop 2 said yesterday that they're still going to vote against it. The people who support Prop 2 said they should still vote for it. For my opinion, I think that those members of the LDS Church who maybe had reservations about the specific language in Prop 2 but wanted medical marijuana, which the church has said all along is their policy, they can now go vote for Prop 2 in good conscience and not have to worry about those provisions kicking in because there's a compromise on the table. And I think that's the best course of action, because if this passes with 80%, then that sends a strong message to these leaders that they have to follow through on these commitments that they've made. There is still a risk that, frankly, that you come December, if we have a special session, or November, depending on when they call it, that they back down, that things change, that the legislature gets cold feet or decides they want to go a different route. The legislature as a body is not committed to doing this. The governor and the lame duck House Speaker, the lame duck Senate President have made their commitments, but they still have to get their ducks in a row.
And I think that's the key. I mean, even if it just turns out to be symbolic, it's still important to let lawmakers know how you feel. So as you said, if it passes by 51% versus if it passes by 70%, that's a different messaging that people want this. And, I've always said that even if your candidate or issue loses, getting out there and voting on it basically lets people know how you felt.
Well, are you feeling like people out in the community after the announcement yesterday are feeling like, okay, you've captured most of what I want? These are for the people who are supportive of Proposition 2. All right. Did we get them, or are they really standing?
I think probably. I know that there were advocates for Proposition 2 that still realized that it wasn't perfect and realized that if it did pass, the legislature would have to go in and make some changes. But I think, I mean, obviously they were all participating in these discussions, and they all say that they're on the same ground, sort of.
There's a huge rift right now in the patient community, frankly, because there was a group of leaders in the Prop 2 movement who really kind of got this ball rolling and spent years trying to bring patients to meet with legislators and get them to understand the suffering that these people are going through. They didn't want to negotiate at all. They thought they had this. They were going to pass it. They said, if you guys wanted to talk, you guys had 4 years. We were happy to talk to you then, but you wouldn't talk to us. You wouldn't do anything. So they wanted to see this thing through. The split is actually so bad that the leader of Truce has formed a separate political issues committee from Libertas's, the coalition that has been pushing for it. So there's a big rift, and maybe it's a divide and conquer kind of thing. So they're not all on board with this. Some of them still want to see it through. Some of them don't trust the church to follow through on their commitment to embrace this. Some of them don't trust the legislature. And one of the really interesting things at the press conference the other day with Mark Madsen, a senator that was from Lehigh, who was the original sponsor of medical marijuana bills in the past, he said he had political whiplash because 2 years ago the church killed his bill. They wouldn't discuss it at all. They wouldn't negotiate. And now the church is holding hands and singing Kumbaya, and after spending hours and hours at the table negotiating this, I think the initiative forced the church's hand. It not only forced the church's hand to come to the table on negotiations, but it forced the church's hand to acknowledge publicly that yes, we support the use of medical marijuana, which was a strong policy statement. They had hinted at it before. They had let bishops decide on their own whether they were going to, whether members could use this or not in states where it's legal. But now the church has said, categorically and officially, yes, we support the use of medical marijuana within these confines. And so that's something I think pretty powerful that the initiative was able to accomplish.
And I think one of the things and you just kind of hit on it, is when you talk about initiatives where they get these compromises, there is a distrust with people because they've seen so many bills get switched or last second changes as people who have covered the legislature for a long time. But when it comes to compromises that are made to avoid initiatives like SB 54 or Our Schools Now, they seem to stick with that. But I think when it comes to this one issue, that's one where people just have distrust in general.
Let's kind of take this theme to what's coming soon. Mail-in ballots go out next week. All right, how is this issue and kind of the issues you've been talking about in terms of trust of the process, Nichole, how is that going to impact people even showing up?
I think people are still energized to vote. Medical marijuana Proposition 2 has been the big one that's gotten a lot of attention this year. There are still 2 other ballot propositions, the gas tax question. We have big candidates, big names on the ballot, the top U.S. Senate, competitive 4th district rate. There are still a lot of other issues happening this election cycle that people are energized about.
None of this process is going to say to these people, I'm just not showing up. I'm so kind of unhappy with
I would
it.
hope not. I mean, historically, midterm turnout in Utah is low. I mean, overall voter turnout in Utah is low. Midterms are about 37 to 40%. I think with some of these issues and some of these names, we will see a little higher turnout than most midterms, but I'm not expecting even maybe 50%.
Robert, with the candidates you're talking to, are they worried?
Worried about the
turnout?
No, I think the anticipation is that there'll be strong turnout, like Nichole said, especially for a midterm election. The mail-in ballot has increased turnout where we've seen it used in the past, and I think it also puts a premium on the candidate's organization, because whereas before, you could pester candidates to get to the polls on Tuesday, you could, send buses out to senior centers and bus them there and things like that. This is now much more strategic, I guess, or where you have the names of the people who've requested ballots, or people who have mail-in ballots, and you keep pestering them until they get their ballots in, and you can track your supporters and make sure it puts a real premium on the organization.
I think in states where you've seen mail-in ballots, it absolutely increases it, but you do have to take a different strategy. I had one campaign manager who said it's like Groundhog's Day. You wake up and it's election day again because you had to get out there, get people to turn in their ballots, wake up the next day, turn in, get in your ballots. But I think it's going to be interesting because, I mean, Prop 2 was the big issue that was driving a lot of conversation, a lot of interest and excitement, and it is going to be interesting to see what happens. Now, maybe some people already got registered and they're going to get their mail-in ballot, but I mean, when you don't have to show up on a Tuesday in November and you can have your ballot and look at it and not feel that anxiety of being there and, picking your candidates and the long lines, I think that there's no reason people shouldn't.
Okay. Everyone needs to show up, no doubt about it. Thank you for your comments today. We appreciate it. That's it for this edition of the Hinckley Report. Visit us online at kued.org/Hinckley Report as the panel discusses other issues, including Attorney General Jeff Sessions' visit to Utah. Thank you and good night.